The car entered the tunnel just before midnight. Less than a minute later, the woman in the backseat, a woman who, hours earlier, had been laughing with a waiter over dessert, was fighting for her life. 20 years before that night, she was nobody in particular. A shy 19-year-old who worked as a kindergarten assistant, who wasn't even sure she'd get into the one job she wanted. Then, almost overnight, she became Princess Diana. And from that point on, she never really had a private moment again. Here's the part of this story that people forget. Her death isn't actually the strangest thing about her life. The strangest thing is how an ordinary young woman thrown into the oldest, most rigged institution in Britain became more loved than the institution itself, and how that love may have been part of what got her killed. So let's go back to the beginning, because to understand that tunnel in Paris, you have to understand a nursery school in London. Diana Frances Spencer was born in July 1961 into Old English aristocracy. Not royal, but close enough to it that royalty was always somewhere nearby. Her family had rented a home from the Queen's own father for generations. As a child, she literally played on the grounds next to Sandringham, one of the royal family's private estates. But her childhood wasn't a fairy tale. Her parents' marriage collapsed when she was young, and the divorce that followed was ugly, public, and by the standards of the time, scandalous. Diana later said she never really got over her mother leaving. In July 1981, more than 750 million people around the world watched Diana marry Charles at St. Paul's Cathedral. It remains one of the most watched broadcasts in television history. She wore a dress with a 25-foot train. Crowd packed the streets of London for a glimpse of her carriage. To the outside world, it looked like the perfect modern fairy tale. A shy young woman becoming a princess. But behind the scenes, the marriage was already fragile. Charles had a long, deep relationship with a woman named Camilla Parker Bowles, a relationship that by most accounts never fully ended, even after his wedding to Diana. Diana didn't find out the full truth right away. She pieced it together slowly. In a palace that had no real playbook for comforting a young, isolated 21-year-old who just realized her marriage might not be what she thought it was. What followed was one of the loneliest periods of Diana's life. Even as the world outside believed she was living a dream, she was expected to navigate rigged royal protocols she'd barely been trained for, all while being trailed constantly by a press that had turned her into the most photographed woman on earth almost overnight. Diana later spoke publicly about struggling deeply during these years, describing a marriage where, in her words, there were 3 people and it felt crowded. She talked about the isolation of being surrounded by an institution that valued composure over honesty, and how hard that was for someone who felt things as openly as she did. But instead of disappearing into that role the way the institution might have preferred, something unexpected happened. The public fell for her anyway, not despite her openness, but because of it. She held the hands of AIDS patients without gloves at a time when many people were still terrified to touch them. She knelt down to talk to sick children so she'd be at their eye level instead of towering over them. Nobody coached her to do any of that. It was just who she was, and it made her very quickly more popular than the family she'd married into.
HIV does not make people dangerous to know, so you can shake their hands and give them a hug. Heaven knows they need it.
Princess Diana come in, will she or won't she wear gloves? And she didn't.
By the early 1990s, the marriage was public wreckage. Books, leak tapes, and tabloid headlines laid the whole thing out for the country to read over breakfast. In 1992, Charles and Diana officially separated. Then, in 1995, Diana did something no one expected. She gave an extraordinary unauthorized interview to the BBC, arranged without the palace's knowledge, and spoke directly and candidly about her marriage, her mental health struggles, and her place, or lack of one, inside the royal family.
Do you think you'll ever be queen?
No, I don't. No.
Why do you think that?
I'd like to be a queen of people's hearts, in people's hearts. But I don't see myself being queen of this country. I don't think many people would want me to be queen. Actually, when I say many people, I mean the establishment that I'm married into, because they've decided that I'm a non-starter.
Why do you think they've decided that?
Because I do things differently, because I don't go by a rule book, because I lead from the heart, not the head. And albeit that's got me into trouble in my work, I understand that. But someone's got to go out there and love people and show it.
It's the interview people still quote. She described the loneliness of royal life in devastatingly plain language, and it reshaped how the public understood everything they thought they knew about her marriage. The palace was reportedly blindsided. The divorce was finalized the following year. Diana lost the title Her Royal Highness. What she gained, for the first time in over a decade, was a life that was actually hers to shape. In the years right after the divorce, she threw herself into work that had nothing to do with royal duty and everything to do with what she actually cared about: campaigning against landmines, visiting conflict zones, sitting with people dying of AIDS when much of the world still wouldn't. People close to her said this was the first time in years she seemed genuinely herself.
What's she feeding this young man on? He weighs a ton.
On August 31st, 1997, Diana had dinner in Paris with Dodi Fayed, a film producer she'd been seeing. Outside the hotel, dozens of photographers were waiting, as they always were by then. To avoid them, the driver took a different route, fast through the Point d'Alma tunnel. Less than a minute later, the car lost control and slammed into a support pillar at high speed. Dodi Fayed and the driver were killed instantly. Diana survived the initial impact and was rushed to a Paris hospital, but died a few hours later. She was 36-year-old. The official investigation later found the driver was significantly over the legal alcohol limit and driving well above the speed limit, and that the pursuit by photographers had contributed to the chaos of those final minutes. None of that made the news any easier for the millions of people who woke up the next morning to find out she was gone. What happened next was unlike anything Britain had seen. Mountains of flowers peeled up outside Kensington Palace, higher than some of the gates themselves. People who had never met Diana, who had no personal connection to her at all, stood in line for hours just to sign a book of condolence. Some people look at Diana's story and see a victim, a young woman pulled into an institution that was never built to hold someone like her, and that never really tried to protect her from what came with the fame it gave her. Others push back on the framing, pointing out that Diana, more than almost anyone in that family's history, learned to use her fame deliberately to make people care about landmine victims, about AIDS patients, about cause the palace would never have touched. Maybe the truth sits somewhere between those two ideas, but very few people in modern history have shaped how the public feels about an entire institution just by being visibly, stubbornly human inside of it, and very few have left behind a question this hard to fully answer. Was Diana a casualty of the fame that was forced on her, or was that same fame the only tool she ever really had to make sure the world actually hurt her? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment and subscribe. See ya.